Well, this week we're looking at what I guess on the outside appears to be a very self contained issue. Definitely an issue in computer ethics or information technology ethics, whatever we're calling the thing now. But as I think is quite common when we look at these specific issues, they lead to larger questions, bigger questions, more fateful questions. Again, on the surface, it's really about a guy hurtling down the highway asleep in his Tesla while it's on autopilot, and what's up with that, right? But this quote at the top is from the Moral Machine reading, the article by the people who conducted that vast survey, that vast moral survey about people's choices and different, how they would program an autopilot to respond to different accident situations. And the authors say, never in the history of humanity have we allowed a machine to autonomously decide who should live and who should die. That's a very nice way of putting it. And I think it's quite striking. If you looked at the introductory video where I look over the course as a whole, you'll know that a very important reading for us will be week 4 when we look at Hans Jonas's Technology and Responsibility, which I consider to be this kind of a very, very important milestone in philosophers thinking about what's different about the modern age and the kind of problems, unique problems that philosophy and human beings will be faced with after they've passed a certain point in terms of the development of the power of their technology. They will be faced with questions that traditional ethical narratives or ethical theories or ethical traditions will not be able to provide answers to, because they will be wholly novel questions, because we are in a completely, well, that's a question. We're in a very different, if not completely different point in human history, very different from the condition under which those moral traditions developed. But that's to a certain sense to anticipate, and we will read Jonas in week 4, and then move on to some subjects that he would certainly recognize as being the kind of subjects that challenge the kinds of traditional ethical approaches that we looked at in week 1 with utilitarianism and Kantianism. But that's not to, okay, so that's the kind of thing I want you to be thinking about as this course develops, is whether moral approaches like Kantianism and utilitarianism are sufficient to handle the kind of questions that digital technology poses to us, which is an open question, right? I mean, but we'll see. But that's something I think that this statement is quite true. That is, if autopilot is programmed in a certain way to make certain decisions, difficult decisions, not difficult for the computer, but difficult for us, in terms of what to do in very, very dire automobile accident situations that will determine who will live and who will die, who will be injured and who will not, that we are probably, I mean, that's something to think about, whether it's true. Maybe there have been previous similar or analogous situations, but certainly it is a big step. And that's just the kind of thing that Jonas, as we'll see, is asking us to be aware of, is how big a step we're taking when we institute these technologies, when we employ these technologies, that what a fateful step it is. But what is the problem? I'm just going to briefly, hopefully briefly, go over some quotes from the different readings here. It's sort of not like week 1 where there was some very specific material that I wanted to get across. This is more of taking a look at taking a broad look at this issue and then developing our thoughts about it. That's why there won't be a quiz this week. There'll be review questions as your assignment, because it just doesn't really lend itself to that sort of thing. This is from the New York Times article about the phenomenon of people taking, it's pretty ironic, people taking cell phone videos while they're driving to show that other people are driving unsafely or not driving unsafely. But that irony is, of course, pointed out. I mean, there's nothing that's more conducive to car accidents than using your cell phone while you're driving. So there's an irony there. But that's what this article is really about, and that's kind of what starts us off on the issue. He says himself, the author, what's fascinating is the way the sci-fi novelty of Autopilot, combined with the deep familiarity of old-fashioned driving, manages to warp our danger-detecting radar. Like, we're so used to the world being a certain way that if we see a person asleep behind the wheel of a car driving, especially driving at high speeds, then we are alarmed. We are alarmed, and we feel like we need to do something about it, or at least we're outraged about it. But really, the question is, is it really that dangerous? I mean, what's more dangerous, falling asleep while your car is on autopilot, or whipping out a cell phone to take a picture of it, right? This raises one of the issues that comes up later, and that is, as human beings, we seem to be equipped with certain tools, ethical and otherwise, for dealing with situations like this. But these tools are a matter of our evolutionary history and our past history as a species. So it's not clear that the conclusions that we come to, like being outraged by somebody asleep behind the wheel of their car while it's on autopilot, are really rational and appropriate. This is at the end of the essay. The next thing he says, it's hard to imagine a more potent visual metaphor for this feeling than a human lulled to sleep inside a hunk of metal and glass, hurtling down a highway under the control of proprietary algorithms beamed on board from Palo Alto. These videos are magnetic not just because of the eerie images they contain, but also because watching them, we can't actually be sure what we're seeing. Is this danger or safety, or both at once? Perhaps in a different era, we would have cried out in excitement, how cool. Today, we are more tempted to gasp in shock and call out a warning, wake up. I think the last part of that is really a reference to something he says earlier, and I remember in the essay, and that is, we used to live in eras of more positivity and optimism about progress of technology. I think people used to trust technology more. People used to be glad in a sort of unambivalent way about technological developments. They saw it as the cutting edge of the bright new future. Whereas today, maybe after Hans Jonas, for me at least, that we see progress differently. We're much more ambivalent about it. We see its downside. We see its dangers. And so we're not sure how to respond to the driver asleep in his Tesla. And, that last part is really picked up here in this next little newspaper piece, The Ethical Dilemmas of Self-Driving Cars. Because what he points out is that, they're safer. I mean, if all our cars became automated in the way that at least it seems that it's possible to automate them, then we would have fewer car accidents. The computers are better at driving cars, or at least will be better at driving cars than human beings. That, I think, is the ambivalence, not knowing whether to say how cool or good or wake up, right? Because it may be that autopilot is saving your life, given the flaws of human drivers. So it may just be that, autopilot is a great boon, is a great thing for human beings, because, it's like, I don't know. I have an older friend, my best friend, who's a little older than me. I'm in my 50s. He's in his 70s. And a few years ago, when Amazon was talking about drone deliveries, which seems, I don't know what happened to that. He got really concerned. You know, I mean, he really got concerned that these drones would cause a real hazard to people, which I regarded as somewhat alarmist. You know, I can't imagine drone deliveries being really, something that'll affect human life all that much, especially in terms of danger. But I think that we tend to respond to the new with anxiety and with distrust. And sometimes I think that anxiety and distrust are irrational. Is our alarmist response, or is our response to the dangers of self-driving cars itself alarmist and irrational? Probably, I think. I don't know enough about it, but I mean, there are going to be accidents that are caused by self-driving cars, but if you're a utilitarian, right, you probably would have to admit that they're fewer than the ones that are caused by humans driving cars. So, it's a plus, I guess. But of course, then this question, okay, there'll be fewer accidents, but there will be accidents. The question becomes, how do we program the car to actually respond to those accidents? We have to tell the car what to do beforehand, because we have to tell the computer what to do beforehand, what sort of decisions it will make. This is what really raises this question here, that we have to have a machine, autonomously decide in the situation what to do, although it just follows our programming, right? At least for now. We'll talk about the singularity later on. Well, I mean, that is the question. How, if we're going to program a car to respond and to, in scare quotes, make choices that would determine who lives and who dies, who's injured and who's not, and how would we do it? The moral machine experiment is really an attempt to solve that problem, right? I mean, beginnings, and it's interesting, right? And what they say, I think, is quite true. This is from somewhere in the discussion. Decisions about the ethical principles that will guide autonomous vehicles cannot be left solely to either the engineers or the ethicists. For consumers to switch from traditional human-driven cars to autonomous vehicles, and for the wider public to accept the proliferation of artificial intelligence-driven vehicles on their roads, both groups will need to understand the origins of the ethical principles that are programmed into these vehicles. In other words, even if ethicists were to agree on how autonomous vehicles should solve moral dilemmas, their work would be useless if citizens were to disagree with their solution and thus opt out of the future that autonomous vehicles promise in lieu of the status quo. Any attempt to devise artificial intelligence ethics must be at least cognizant of public morality. Accordingly, we need to gauge social expectations about how autonomous vehicles should solve moral dilemmas. Well, that's quite interesting, and on the face of it, I think a quite positive, healthy approach, because it's democratic. On the other hand, it begs a lot of questions about what morality is, and how what's good and what's right and what's proper should be determined. That is a very interesting thing, the moral machine experiment, and I hope you take it. I took it, and at the very least, it's fun or interesting, because it's a game. But after all, it's just a survey. It's not that moral machine experiment doesn't determine what is right and wrong in any of those situations for the car to do. The experiment just records what you would do. And so overall, what it does is to record people's opinions about what the right thing to do is. And so the question then is, can you determine what's right and wrong by popular opinion? That's a very difficult question. I think that Kant would be appalled, right? and many other moral philosophers would be appalled. But that doesn't vitiate what the moral machine experiment is doing. I think it's doing good work, and it's giving us a lot of insight into the way people think, and maybe some cultural differences and differences in approach, and maybe difficulties. But what is the point here? Is the point to get people used to self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, or is the point to do the right thing? It's not really clear from this paragraph, whether this kind of work like they're doing with the experiment needs to be done because we need to figure out the right way to do it, or whether it needs to be done because we have to figure out the right way to market it and to prepare people to accept this radical new technology. Because from the other point of view, this is from the longer essay, Automated Ethics, which is kind of the best thing that I gave you, I think, best written thing that I gave you. He references this book by, Green, called Moral Tribes. And this is certainly not a unique position, but the general position from this guy Green in Moral Tribes is that our moral instincts, if you want to call them, are atavistic. They're throwbacks, and they're not sufficient for the modern period. In his latest book, Moral Tribes, Green, I'm right here, acknowledges that almost everyone feels an instinctual sense of moral wrong about people using personal force to harm someone else. For him, this instinctual moral sense is important, but far from perfect. A morsel of deep-rooted brain function, which would mean evolutionarily developed brain function, and therefore developed in a much different situation than we're in right now, so maybe not sufficient, that can hardly be expected to keep up with civilizational progress. That was my point, better put. It privileges the immediate over the distant and actions over emissions. It cannot follow complex chains of cause and effect. It is, in other words, singularly unsuitable for judging human actions as amplified by the vast apparatus of global trade, politics, technology, and economic interconnection. That's a point that Jonas will make, or did make, in the essay that we will read. He did not think that there was a clear answer to how to respond to that. But somebody like Green apparently thinks that the best response is just strict utilitarianism, which is, I don't know. That is, I'm thinking of what's said right here. Or as the conclusion of Moral Tribes more bluntly puts it, we must question the laws written in our hearts and replace them with something better. This something better looks more than a little like a self-driving car. And what that really means is that something better means algorithmic, utilitarian decision-making rather than human, sloppy, and Kantian decision-making too, I guess. After all, if common sense morality is a marvelous but regrettably misfiring hunk of biological machinery, what greater opportunity could there be than to set some pristine new code in motion, unweighted by a bewildered brain? I don't dismiss that position, because I think some very serious people are suggesting that we need to leave our old ways of making moral decisions behind for very practical reasons, maybe just for survival or to preserve a decent society. We need to have some sort of evolutionary leap in our decision making, or at least we have to leave behind some of the human aspects of moral decision making. That is a question to be debated. I'm not going to dismiss that. I mean, it sounds wild and it sounds crazy, and it's certainly something that would need to be done with a lot of thought and care, as we'll see in further discussions of this. But I don't think it's a crazy idea. So just look through the readings and other things I've given you on this topic. Take the moral machine test, or not survey. It's not a test, really. see what you think, and I'll just give you some study questions to do.